Warren finishes securing his remote Alaskan cabin as a brutal blizzard rolls in. The fire crackles inside while the wind howls like a living thing. Just as the storm peaks, an unnatural scratching interrupts the night, too deliberate to be branches. Through the frosted window, two wolves appear, a wounded female leaving bloodied paw prints and a protective male who meets Warren's gaze with unsettling intelligence. Warren's fingers hovered over the door handle, his breath fogging in the freezing air as the wolves' pleading eyes bore into his. Every instinct screamed at him to leave them outside. Wild animals didn't belong in a man's home, especially not predators with teeth sharp enough to tear flesh. But the female's labored breathing and the male's silent, desperate vigilance made his hand twist the knob before his mind could protest. The moment the door cracked open, the male wolf nudged the injured female forward, his golden eyes never leaving Warren's face. They moved with deliberate caution, their paws leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. The male positioned himself between Warren and the female, not in aggression, but in wary protection, as if he understood that this human might be their only chance. Warren grabbed his medical kit, his hand steadier than he expected. The female flinched as he approached, but the male let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something closer to reassurance. She stilled, allowing Warren to examine her leg. The wound was deep, likely from a trap, the flesh raw and swollen. As he cleaned it, the female whimpered but didn't snap, her dark eyes locked onto his with an unsettling intelligence. He offered them scraps of meat from his pantry, expecting them to lunge or fight over it. Instead, the male waited, allowing the female to eat first before taking his share with surprising gentleness. They avoided knocking over furniture, stepping around objects as if they understood the fragility of human spaces. When the fire crackled too loudly, the female startled, pressing against the male, who responded by licking her ear, a gesture so tender it made Warren's throat tighten. Night deepened, and the storm raged outside, but inside, an unspoken truce settled. The wolves didn't sleep. The male remained alert, his ears twitching at every gust of wind, while the female rested her head on her paws, watching Warren with an expression he couldn't decipher. It wasn't just survival driving them, it was something deeper, something almost human in its complexity. Warren leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him. He had lived alone in the wilderness for years, believing he understood its rules. But these wolves defied them. They weren't just animals seeking shelter, they were thinking, feeling creatures who had chosen to trust him. And that realization left him with a question that echoed louder than the storm outside. The first gray light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, painting the room in muted shadows. Warren stirred from his uneasy sleep to find both wolves already alert, ears pricked forward, bodies tense. The male stood rigid by the door, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, while the female, despite her injury, had dragged herself upright, her hackles raised. A low, guttural growl rumbled in the male's throat, not directed at Warren, but at something outside. Warren's pulse spiked. Moving carefully, he crossed to the window and wiped away the frost with his sleeve. The storm had passed, leaving the world eerily still, the snow-laden trees standing like silent sentinels. At first, he saw nothing. Then, boot prints. A fresh set of tracks circled the cabin, pressing deep into the snow before disappearing into the tree line. They weren't his own. And they weren't from yesterday. The realization struck him like a physical blow. These wolves hadn't just been fleeing the storm, they'd been hunted. The male wolf's golden eyes locked onto Warren's, and in that moment, something wordless passed between them. The animal didn't bare his teeth or snarl. Instead, he took up a position in front of the door, his muscular frame blocking the entrance, his stance that of a soldier preparing for battle. The female, though limping, positioned herself beside him, her lips peeling back in a soundless warning. Warren's hands clenched into fists. Poachers. He'd heard the stories. Men who prowled these woods, setting traps, selling pelts and trophies to the highest bidder. These wolves hadn't stumbled upon his cabin by accident. They'd been running. And now, the hunters had followed. A branch snapped outside. The male's ears flattened. The female let out a barely audible whine, her body trembling, not from fear, Warren realized, but from fury. They knew. And somehow, against all instinct, they decided he was their best chance. Warren grabbed his shotgun from the wall, the weight familiar in his hands. He didn't know when the wolves had become his to protect. But as he met the male's gaze, steady, calculating, trusting, He knew one thing for certain. They weren't just sheltering under his roof anymore. They were allies. And the real predators were outside. Warren's breath came in sharp, visible puffs as he pressed his back against the cabin wall, the shotgun's cold metal biting into his palms. The wolves stood beside him, the male rigid as steel at his right, the female limping but determined at his left.
Outside, the crunch of snow under heavy boots grew louder.
Closer.
Then, silence.
A heartbeat passed. Through. The door exploded inward. A burly man in a fur-lined parka filled the doorway, rifle raised. His eyes widened at the sight of Warren armed and ready, then flicked to the wolves.
A vicious grin split his frost-reddened face.
"Well, look what we got here," he drawled. "2 for the price of—" The male wolf moved like lightning. He didn't growl, didn't snarl, just launched himself in a silent, deadly arc straight for the poacher's throat. The man barely got his arm up in time, screaming as fangs sank into his forearm instead. Chaos erupted. Warren's shotgun roared, the blast deafening in the confined space as a second intruder staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The female wolf lunged at the third man, her injured leg forgotten in her fury, her teeth snapping just shy of his face as he scrambled backward. The cabin became a whirlwind of snarls and shouts. A lantern shattered, spraying glass. The male wolf wrenched the first poacher to the ground, his growl vibrating through the floorboards. Warren barely dodged a wild punch, driving the butt of his shotgun into another attacker's gut.
Get the hell out. Warren roared over the cacophony.
The poachers didn't need telling twice. The one still standing dragged his bleeding companion toward the door, their boots slipping on the blood-smeared floor.
The last man out hurled a final, terrified glance at the wolves, now standing shoulder to shoulder with Warren, before vanishing into the storm. Silence fell, broken only by the wolves' panting breaths and the wind howling through the open door.
Warren's hands shook as he lowered the shotgun. The male wolf released his grip on a torn parka sleeve, spitting it aside. The female limped to Warren's side, her warm tongue rasping once over his knuckles, a fleeting but unmistakable gesture. Gratitude. Trust. Then, as suddenly as they'd come, the wolves turned. The male paused at the threshold, casting one last golden-eyed look over his shoulder. Not at the cabin. Not at the scattered evidence of battle. At Warren. Then they were gone, their silhouettes swallowed by the swirling snow. Warren stood there long after the last paw print had vanished, the cold seeping into his bones. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and wet fur, of blood and something wilder. Something he knew he'd never forget. Outside, the storm raged on. But for the first time in years, Warren didn't feel alone in it. The days that followed the confrontation with the poachers settled into an uneasy quiet. Warren spent hours repairing the splintered doorframe, his fingers working methodically over the wood as his mind replayed every second of that violent encounter. The cabin still carried traces of the wolves, tufts of silver fur caught in the floorboards, faint paw prints near the hearth that even vigorous scrubbing couldn't entirely erase. At first, Warren told himself he was imagining things. The way the trees seemed to whisper at dusk, the occasional rustle in the underbrush that was too deliberate to be the wind. But then he found the first gift, a freshly killed hare left neatly on his porch, its fur unmarred save for the precise puncture wounds at its throat. The kind of kill only a skilled predator could make. He started setting out offerings of his own, venison scraps during the worst storms, a bowl of melted snow when the temperatures plummeted. The food always disappeared by morning, though he never saw them take it. Only the delicate tracery of paw prints in the fresh snow betrayed their visits.
Then came the night of the aurora.
Warren stood on his porch, breath fogging in the air as the northern lights painted the sky in undulating ribbons of green and violet. The forest hummed with an almost electric energy, the snow glowing faintly under the celestial display. And then, a sound that made his heart stutter. A howl. Not the random cries of wild wolves, but a clear, deliberate call that rose and fell in perfect harmony with the shimmering lights. A second voice joined the first, then a third, deeper, resonant, until the very air seemed to vibrate with their song. Warren knew. He couldn't explain how, but he knew. The female's voice was the higher pitch, strong and healed now. The male's deeper timbre held a cadence he recognized, that same measured intelligence he'd seen in those gold-flecked eyes. And the third, a new voice, younger perhaps, learning the rhythms of the wild. The howls faded gradually, leaving only the crackle of the aurora overhead. Warren remained still, his bare hands numb from cold, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. In the weeks that followed, the gifts became more frequent. A perfect grouse here, a plump snowshoe hare there, always left where he'd find them. Warren began taking longer walks, his eyes scanning the tree line not with wariness, but with quiet anticipation. Sometimes, if he stayed very still at dusk, he'd catch a flash of silver between the pines or the gleam of watchful eyes reflecting the fading light. The wilderness no longer felt like something to endure. The wolves had shown him that, had reminded him that even in the harshest of lands, there were connections that ran deeper than survival. They weren't pets. They weren't tame. But they remembered. And so did he. On the first day of spring, Warren found a single wolf track pressed into the mud at the edge of his property, larger than the others, unmistakably the male's. He knelt, brushing his fingers over the imprint. When he looked up, the forest seemed to hold its breath.
Somewhere beyond the trees, a branch snapped.
Warren smiled. He left an extra portion of meat out that night.